So that's okay. So there's lots about that that's really cool. So I mentioned earlier that I'm writing this book, We Who Wrestle with God, and part of it's an analysis of different biblical stories. And I just did a seminar down in Miami that we released a couple of weeks ago on Exodus. And there's a cool part of Exodus that's very much relevant, I think, to what happened with your father. And it's the famous story of the burning bush. So what happens in the story of the burning bush, like this is an unbelievably useful story, is that, so at this time in the story, Moses is really a nobody. He's left Egypt. He was kind of a nobleman in Egypt, but he killed an Egyptian and he had to like get the hell out of there. And he went to a different country, to Midia. I think it's Midia. The Midianites live there anyways. And he draws some water from a well for some women, and they're pretty happy about it. I think he chases some rude, like, punk shepherds away. And anyways, the girl falls in love with him, and he ends up being a shepherd for his father-in-law, whose name is Jethro. And so he's just minding his own damn business, fundamentally, being a shepherd. He's out there in the middle of nowhere, unknown. And he's wandered around one day, and something catches his attention. And he turns off his path, and the story makes this quite clear. It's not like it screams in front of him. It's kind of off the beaten path a little bit. Something glimmers and catches his attention, and he decides to pay attention and go look. And as he gets closer to it, he realizes it's this bush on fire. And as he gets closer to it, he hears God's voice speaking, and then he has to take off his shoes because he enters sacred territory. And then the secret of being itself reveals itself to him. That's God revealing his name. And that's when Moses becomes a leader. And you might say, well, what the hell does that story have to do with anything? And it's very, very clear. And it's very clear psychologically, because as we're wandering along our paths in life, our normal paths, so in Moses' case, being a shepherd, in your dad's case, being a hunter and manufacturing duck calls, nothing out of the ordinary in some ways about that. Now and then something will glimmer and gleam for us that'll capture our attention, and we can choose to pay attention to that or not. Now, Moses pays attention to it, but so did your dad, right? So you said he did some sound work, for example, for the local church. And so he developed a little bit of expertise with the new technology. And then he had this idea, which is, it's not exactly a normal idea. It's pretty experimental and entrepreneurial idea that he could take this new technology that he was interested in and do something unique with it. And there was a little bit of courage that went along with that too, and a willingness to go off the beaten path. And then you said too that I also think so interesting is, and everybody who's watching and listening should listen to this, because what I see happening to people in their life all the time is that an opportunity will gleam for them, and they notice they're interested in it, but then they don't have the discipline or maybe the courage to pursue it. They're afraid they'd fail. They're afraid it would be foolish. They're afraid they would look bad. And so they put it aside. And so it looks like they've missed nothing, but maybe they missed, the burning bush and God speaking to them. Maybe they missed the whole adventure of their life. Now, one of the things that's quite interesting about you guys, and maybe this also has something to do with your practice of gratitude, is that, well, first of all, your father pursued this strange interest that he had, and then did something somewhat preposterous, which was to make these films that were sort of tongue-in-cheek about his duck hunting, and to play himself as a character. But then also, when the entrepreneurial opportunities came along, you guys also jumped on them and said yes, and that really flowered outward, grew outward like a bush, let's say, when it came to Walmart, right? And one of the things you also see about artists and entrepreneurs who want to fail is that they get high and mighty inappropriately about commercial opportunities. You hear people say this all the time. He sold out, or I would never sell out. And whenever I hear someone who isn't very successful say they wouldn't sell out, I always think, well, yes, you would, first of all. And the reason you haven't is either because you're too dumb to sell out, or because no one's come to you with even anything vaguely approximating an offer. And the fact that you haven't sold out when no one has offered you a penny for your soul is no indication of your morality. It just means that no one cares what you're doing. Now, and I'm being tongue in cheek about that to some degree, but I do see people fail very often because they take the moral high ground, or at least they think they do, by rejecting commercial opportunities that might come their way. And your dad was obviously canny enough to pursue his creative interests, and that's very interesting, and his experimental interests to make these videos, but also to say yes when a business opportunity came his way. And you said, well, that just grew. Well, it grew incrementally to begin with, but then when you hit Walmart, it was like, well, that was the beginning of that cataclysmic expansion. And people miss those opportunities for expansion when they say no to things that they should say yes to, right? And they get high and mighty about it, and it's stupid. You should be happy if an opportunity comes your way.
Absolutely, yeah. We both I come from family business as well, and our family, I think one of the gifts that they passed down and that we kind of like utilized in growing the business was that spirit of like risk and entrepreneurship, and it's okay. And I think that, so our family had a lot of businesses, and some failed and a few were successful, really successful, but a lot of them failed.
Walmart bought one of your businesses.
Actually, yeah, Sam Walton bought one of our family businesses. I forgot. Yeah, that's true. So interestingly, yeah, so I grew up in kind of this home where risk-taking was a reward and was a positive because, you tried something and it was okay if you failed and that type of thing. And I think back to faith as being kind of this undergirding of that. It's like, if you know that you're going to be okay if it fails. And I think that was told to us, over and over again growing up. My dad would say, hey, if we lose it all tomorrow, it's all right. We still got what's most important. So it's this grounding of like, okay, what's most important is our family and our faith. And if we lose all of this other stuff, all right, we'll be all right. We'll get back up and do something else tomorrow. And so whenever we came together, I think that was a benefit because we kind of brought those two worlds together.
Well, I'd say the difference to, like, obviously not knowing your family for so long, but even back then, there was a bunch of different tries at it. So it was like, we'll try this. And even us today, we're like, hey, we'll try that. Hey, we'll try this. Mm-hmm. I think growing up where we were, like with Duck Commander and the business, that was it. We're saying we're all in, like, we're all in. Like, it wasn't like, we'll try this on the side. We'll try all the chips were shoved in the middle going, we're going to put it all right here. And it wasn't a lot of chips, though, because it was like, because most of it was being fueled by the personality. Or it wasn't like we had tons of money ever invested. It was like, but we are. This is what we're going for. Yeah. And we could always, Dad was always good, like saying, if this doesn't work, hey, we keep fishing and we keep eating, the standards were low. It's like, hey, we're totally happy in what we've got,
That's very cool. Like you outlined something very interesting there, because one of the things that people might be thinking about is, well, what constitutes failure and what constitutes success, and how do you stop failure from taking you out? And one of the things you both pointed out is that you're actually pretty careful about defining failure. You say, well, look, if this limited enterprise fails, we still have our family, we still have the love and respect we have for each other, and we have a backup plan. And so what that means is that you set yourself up strategically so that failure, it wasn't failure, it was just the death of an experimental enterprise. And then I might also ask you, because you had your family, you had things in place that weren't going to shift, even if some things shifted, right? So you have some security in that regard that enables you to take risks. But then we also might think about failure too. Like, I don't know what it's like for you guys, but here's one of the things I've noticed in my life is that I don't think I've ever actually failed when I was all in. And what I mean by that is that my plans, business plans included, might not have turned out the way I had expected them to. But if I was all in and I made the right sacrifices, so to speak, I learned something unbelievably useful that I could then use in something that turned out to be successful. I've even noticed this when I'm writing. So, when I'm writing a book, I collect the pieces of writing that I've edited out. I put a little I title a file culls, and I throw everything that I don't think fits into that cull. It's sort of like a waste bin, but it's not exactly a waste bin because I can often go back to those ideas and figure out how to use them somewhere else. And so one of the things I've noticed in my life, and I think it's interesting that you commented, Willie, about being all in, is that if you're really focused on the task at hand, there isn't any wasted effort. Like it isn't necessarily the case that you're progressing to the goal you have in mind. But if you're all in and you're not mucking about, then you learn something that you're going to be able to, that's going to be of benefit to you and other people at some point in the future. And so, and Korie, you talked about your father and his attitude towards failure. I mean, it sounds that what it's more like, it's not so much an attitude towards failure, it's a conceptualization of moving forward as an experimental enterprise, right? You're going to generate ideas, and some of them are really going to go somewhere, but most won't. And, that's typical of entrepreneurs. Like most people who make a fortune have failed enough to be in financial distress multiple times before they finally formulate something that works. But that doesn't mean that they were failing. It means that they were experimenting in good faith, and they didn't lose faith, and they had enough supports put in around them so that they could tolerate, the ups and downs of trying to make something eventually successful. Now, you also said that was grounded in your faith. So you have your family, you have your fishing, right? You have something underneath you, but why do you think that the faith under that, how do you conceptualize that faith, and why do you think that was additionally necessary?
I think like you mentioned, it's that difference in definition of success, and what we deem as success. And so it gives you that freedom. Like success is faithfulness. Success is a healthy marriage. Success is a family, kids that love you and that want to live beside you. Success are all of these things. And so when you understand what your definition of success is, and it's those things, then you have that freedom to experiment and try new things. And it's okay if this doesn't work or this doesn't work, as long as this is working. And I think that goes back to faithfulness. And for us, that's rooted in our faith in God, because that's what changes everything for us. Whenever you have that faith in God, you come up under the authority of God, then you try to live by the life that He puts out for you, the adventure and the full life that He gives you, and then everything that we do reflects that. And so you mentioned in our show, it wasn't preaching, and it wasn't meant to be preaching. It was just our faith shown through, because it's who we are. It's how we relate to one another in marriage. It's how we relate to our kids. It's how we treat one another at work. It just informs everything that we do. So there's this faith that surrounds it all, but you don't have to say it explicitly, because it's just internal, and it's who we are, and it's how we live.
It's what makes us laugh. I mean, it's what brings us joy, because it's like, so when I think about, because you said it's rooted in our faith, that to me, it's the ultimate, and nothing is wasted is rooted in the faith. Yeah. Because you would say, well, what about when you really screwed up? Or what about when this happened and this was terrible? Well, that's what triggers back that faith again, going, oh no, it's not a waste, To where if you were looking at Jesus Christ going, what a waste, they killed him, he's like, not a waste, this was for you. So it's everything keeps going back, and it always is like, nothing's wasted. Can I take something where I really messed up, where you're like, this is bad, can I take that and use that? And yes, that can be used. Yes, that can be used to help not just you. And if you think about life unselfishly, it may help someone else. It may be, this is really hard for me, but wow, it really helped you. It really helped someone else. And I think that's why we say it's rooted there, because nothing becomes wasted. Everything becomes something that can be used, for we think for the glory of God, ultimately, because we have to put ourselves down as well, and the life's not all about us, for sure.
Okay, so Korie, you outlined a very interesting, I would call it a hierarchy of values, and I think that it is reflected in your show and in your general attitude, and I do think that this is part of what made what you guys did so attractive. So this is what you basically said to me. You said, first of all, your head is screwed on straight with regard to what constitutes success. Now, you could say, well, success is cocaine and hookers and, the extension of a radically hedonistic life. You can do whatever the hell you want, whenever you want. And the clear problem with that is you tend to die, right? You end up face down in a ditch and you take a lot of people with you. So it's kind of a stupid definition of success. You had a very prosaic definition of success, right? It's very normal, but also ideal at the same time. You said, and I think you said in this order, you said a good marriage, a good family, and good friends. And so you could see that moves from you to your primary relationship, and then to your family, the next set of primary relationships, and then to the community. You said if things are working well there, and this is somewhat independent of economic status, then you're successful. And so that's, it's good to have your head screwed on straight about what's successful, because that also means that when you have that, you can be grateful, right? You think, well, and you have a grounds for gratitude. And then you implied too that all of that was nested inside a religious faith, right? So that's this turning toward God. And so it's God underneath the marriage, underneath you, underneath the marriage, underneath your family, underneath your friends. And so then, and Willie, you said as well that your faith, and this was your religious faith, enabled you to laugh. Okay, so a couple of things on that. First thing is, one of the benefits to Christian faith is that you have a good standard of comparison. And one standard of comparison with regards to failure is that if you aren't literally being nailed to a cross while you're being mocked by a mob and tortured, things are actually pretty good. And that's really useful to know, because it's easy to think that you're at the bottom and to despair when you're nowhere near the bottom. And if you know you're nowhere near the bottom, even when things have gone sideways, you can still be grateful, and that's extremely helpful. So that's helpful. But then you also said, and this is more complex, you said that your faith, your religious faith, made itself manifest in all the things you did in the show. And I would say, I can understand the idea of the good marriage. I can understand the idea of the close family and your friendship network. But how do you specifically think that your religious faith helped keep you in character, like helped keep you honest while you were doing the show? How it informed your marriage and your relationship with family and friends so that you guys could tolerate the ups and downs of your wild ride towards success without fractionating? Like, what specific role do you think that religious faith per se, rather than marriage, family, and friends, played in keeping you grounded, and also in accounting for the popularity, the enduring popularity of your show?
Well, there's a scripture that talks about the fruit of the Spirit, and it says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, and self-control. And so I think that, whenever we are embodied by the Spirit of Christ, we live those things, and those things come out of us. And so there's also a scripture of talking about the aroma of Christ, and just that, and that we're lights of the world and we're salt of the earth. All these things that, scripture says about us as we are embodied by the Spirit, is how we try to live. And so I think those things just kind of come out of whatever aspect you're doing and whatever thing you're living. Not that we're perfect in it by any means, of course. Right. We're not perfect in it, but we do try to live, and we hope that those fruits, there's an outpouring of those fruits in our life.
Well, and also he says they'll know you by your love for one another, not exactly what you know or how much you know, but that's how they will see it. The way I see it reflected, like especially on the show, is the when it comes down to just the show and how we're on it. I think it, our faith kept us from taking ourselves way too seriously or thinking we're so important. Or, I mean, we had the goods. We could look around going, hey, we've got one of the top TV shows on television right now, which could have made us unbearable. I mean, there were times with production, there were so many things going on where I could just lost my mind. So one of the aspects where the faith came out was actually just to be on set and do the show, because there was just, there was different wars and different things going on, behind the scenes. And so, you had to keep that together to actually do that. And I think just to remain playful and not become so serious, when you were talking about if you're not being crucified and you're not, having that, I think if not, you get, I think that's why people get so caught up and they can't really enjoy success because they're too worried about, either losing it or what's going to come next. And so I just see that as faith doing that. And that's where it's just manifesting itself and just going, hey, I have faith, I mean, this is, plus life is short. I mean, it's really short. And so if you believe that life will continue and that you'll go on, then it should help you, I guess, to have a better disposition here on this earth, knowing that you're just here like that and you're gone. So, that's, I think that comes out in faith as well.
You point out two things there that are interesting. So earlier, you guys talked about the necessity of being all in, that if you made a decision, you were going to put everything behind it. And you can imagine that could devolve into a kind of grim seriousness of purpose and a kind of panic because you've bet everything. Well, first of all, you did say in some ways, it isn't that you hedged your bets, you protected yourself because you had your marriage and your family and your friends, and you weren't going to risk that in your all in. But also, so your faith, it seems to me that your faith enabled you to believe that what you were doing was important and worthwhile, and that it could have a positive effect for you and for other people. But also simultaneously, I suppose by subordinating you to something that was higher on a regular basis, it also stopped you from becoming egotistical and assuming that your success marked you out somehow as, preternaturally special, right? And that's definitely, a temptation for people who are celebrities because, I've thought about this a lot in relationship to Adolf Hitler. Because you could imagine if tens of millions of people thought you were the savior of your country, who are you to say that you're not? And the answer to that has to be, well, you're someone who's subordinated to a higher authority. And if you have a religious faith, that would be the authority of Christ or God. And you're not that. Whatever you are, no matter how spectacular you are and successful, you're definitely not that. If you don't have that and you accumulate faith or fame and notoriety, like what's stopping you from confusing yourself stupidly with the deity? And so it sounds like you guys balanced your faith so that you could take yourself seriously, and presume that what you were doing was worthwhile and important, but it also protected you against the narcissism that can easily emerge when, well, as you said earlier, when you can't even walk down the street without being, constantly recognized and celebrated and put on a pedestal for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're on our home right now, and in our dining room, we have a big scripture on the wall, and it's Romans 12, 9 through 18, and it talks about all those things we just talked about. I was thinking of that as you were saying it. It starts out saying, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good, but then it goes on to talk about not thinking of yourself more highly than you ought, and not trying to, you need to sit with people from all walks of life. You need to be hospitable and all these things. So all these things are kind of right there in that Romans 12 scripture that we have over our table. And so it's just that constant reminder, that we are up under something that's greater than us.
So we're starting to approach the end of this part of our discussion. For everybody watching and listening, I'm going to talk to Willie and Korie Robertson about their marriage on the Daily Wire Plus platform, because I'm very interested in what they've done right, because they actually seem to like each other to some degree, which is nice to see in a married couple that have been together for a long time. I think maybe what we'll do before we close is I'd like to ask you guys what you're doing now and what your future plans are. When we were planning this interview, this podcast discussion, you talked to me a little bit about your future plans. And so do you want to tell everybody what projects you're working on now and what you see in the future, what you're bringing to people in the future?
Yeah, so after the show ended, we, and as we've talked about, just saw kind of that impact of entertainment. And so we started a production company called Tread Lively Productions. And our first film is coming out September 28th in theaters, and it's called The Blind. And it's interesting that we've had so much of a conversation about Willie's dad, Phil, because that is really what this movie is about, is Phil and Kay's story. And we've talked a lot about kind of the success of it and, what happened after, but this is the story before. And it's interesting that we chose to go back and tell the hard days, the hard parts of the story, because I think when you see a family like ours on television, sometimes you could think, oh, of course God used them. They all love each other and they're all this. But actually, scripturally, and you've mentioned several, people in the Bible that God used for big things, but that were really flawed and had really, had these hard stories. And so it's actually, I think people can discount themselves and thinks, oh, I'm out because I didn't do this or I didn't do this right. But instead, God uses the people who are weak, but that surrender their lives to him. And so this is the family story. It's Phil and Kay's story, really. Willie was 2 in the movie, and he was actually played by our grandson, which was really fun. But this is their story and their 10 hard years of marriage that Kay got pregnant in high school, and they went off to college together and had 10 hard years where Phil was an alcoholic. He, was adulterous. He had all the things that you would say, this family will never make it. It's over. And there was a point where it was over. Kay had moved to West Monroe, which is why they ended up here, because Phil had kicked her out of the house. And it was just a real low point in their family life. And a pastor went to the bar where Phil, you want to tell
his
this
sister,
part of it?
yeah. Well, my dad's sister, my Aunt Jan, begged this pastor to go up and preach the gospel to her brother. And I can just imagine this conversation, like it's in a different state, it's like, it's like, oh, tell him to come to church. And, it's like, no, he's running a bar in Southern Arkansas. And that preacher got in that car and drove to that bar and walked into this bar. And Phil was not happy to see him. It was very adversarial. And he shares his faith with him, and nothing happens. Phil says, "I'll keep that in mind." And then when he leaves, it wasn't until Dad really. The movie says when he came to the end of himself, when he was alone, he's in the woods. He lived in the woods for 6 months, running from the state police, which is another reason we end up in Louisiana, to get away from the police. And when he got to that point, that's when he looked back up and said, hey, let me talk to that preacher again. And so what blows me away is that had that not happened, I just can't quit thinking about, like, if that guy doesn't go there and if it doesn't happen and if the marriage busts apart and my life looks completely different, none of this, it's like the whole, I don't go to the church camp to meet her. I'm not talking to you. It's almost like every day is another reflection of what would not have happened. And I would have been, a single parent. Who knows how that would have ended up. There would have been no Duck Commander, no Duck Dynasty. None of that would have happened. And I can almost, like 23andMe, like you can trace it back. And I can trace it back to that one little couple who had no money, no anything. But a guy went up there, shared the gospel. And so that's why the faith is so important, because this is beyond marriage counseling. Dad had kicked us out. The only thing that turned him around was that faith in Jesus Christ, and said, I'm in. And then his life drastically changed. Very similar like where Saul to Paul, it's like you see that kind of like bang,
Yeah.
It was almost like he saw it like Saul did.
Yeah.
This is all detailed, you said, in The Blind?
Yes. So that's in the movie The Blind, which when Willie mentioned Saul to Paul, that's exactly, the story of Saul, because he's blind. Whenever Jesus kind of like blinds him on the road to Damascus, and then it says the scales came off and he was baptized, and at once he started proclaiming that Jesus is the Son of God. And that's really their family story. It was just this miraculous event in their family's life where Jesus revealed himself to Phil. He changed his life. He turned his life to him. He repented of his sin, turned around, came back to their family, and then his mom, Kay, actually forgave him, which is another miraculous thing, because that's not easy to do after living through that. She says he was like the devil, like living through those years with him. She actually forgave him, and their whole life changed.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting. I mean, Korie, you started out this discussion with this observation that in many of the biblical stories, let's say, and this is true of great literature in general, that it's often extremely flawed characters that make the most interesting pathway forward. And that's actually pretty good for everyone, because everyone is flawed. And so if there was no pathway forward for flawed people, we'd all be permanently in hell. And that wouldn't be so great. And so one conclusion you can draw from that is that you shouldn't make the presumption to begin with that your flaws, as egregious as they might be, necessarily bar your way forward if you have goodwill and you're willing to operate in the world properly. Now, we talked a little bit about the story of Exodus, and there's a really good example of that in the Exodus story, because there isn't a more archetypal leader than Moses. And Moses couldn't speak properly. I mean, that's continually, he actually had to ally himself with his brother Aaron. Now, we don't know why. I mean, we don't know if Moses had a speech impediment or if he just wasn't, a very facile public communicator. The story doesn't make it clear, but it does make it clear that he wasn't the sort of person you would have picked to be a leader, because he wasn't verbally competent. And yet he became the ultimate archetypal leader. And I think sometimes people become successful because of their flaws rather than despite them. And so that's a pretty heartening story, in that you shouldn't write yourself off just because there's something wrong with you, because then everyone would be written off. And then the other part of what you just described that's interesting, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out in the movie, is that, it reminds me, I read this, I've been very influenced by this Russian author, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And Solzhenitsyn found himself in the most dreadful circumstances you could really possibly imagine, the most hopeless circumstances. And it wasn't so much like the story you just described, because a lot of this was imposed on him rather than being driven in some ways by his own faults, although he admitted to his faults. First of all, he was on the Russian front when this was in World War II, and Stalin had formulated a pact with Hitler. And so the Russians were dreadfully and absolutely unprepared when the Germans came marching forward. Then Solzhenitsyn, he was writing some letters to a friend that were critical of Stalin's leadership, and the authorities got wind of that, and they threw him in a concentration camp, in a prison camp. And then he was in a prison camp for like decades, and he got cancer, and he was 3/4 starved to death, and he had to memorize this damn book. And you couldn't imagine someone more powerless than Alexander Solzhenitsyn in a more hopeless situation. And yet he formulated a book in his imagination that eventually brought the entire communist enterprise to a shuddering halt. And the story you told is of someone who had wandered pretty damn far off the straight and narrow, right? And who was out in the bush hiding from the cops, which is a pretty hopeless place to be. And you could also imagine that if you had any sense, you'd be pretty down on yourself in a situation like that. You might think you're the sort of basket case that could never be redeemed. And yet, as you pointed out, there was hope for redemption even in those circumstances, and the proper decision led to a whole array of extremely positive events. And so, maybe no matter how deep the abyss you manage to plunge yourself into, if you take responsibility for your flaws and look up, there's still hope. And that'd be nice if it was true. And it sounds like this movie is laying that out, as biographical fact. Now, when is it coming out?
September 28th. And yeah, you just said exactly what we hope, for the film. That's the message, is really that there's no one too far gone. Mm-hmm. There's no one that's without hope. And that's really the message of the film, I believe.
And how has it been finding distributors? Has that been an easy thing for you guys, or have you run into obstacles on that front? I know the people who did the Beyond Freedom movie, for example, they had a hard time finding distributors, partly because it was a faith-based movie. You have a much broader track record of commercial success, so I imagine that worked in your favor. But how has it been finding distributors, and what are your predictions? Are you happy with the film, and what are your predictions about its reception and its success?
Yeah, there's definitely obstacles to finding distributors for our film, and I think other faith-based films. So we're doing a Fathom release, which we're grateful for Fathom, and they've been fantastic to work with. We're right now, I believe, we're in 1,800 theaters, and that's growing day by day. So we're very excited about that. And but yeah, it has definitely, it's not without its challenges. There are gatekeepers to what gets out there, and so we're seeing a little bit of that. But we're really excited about how it turned out. It's been a couple of years work in progress of like all in, like we talked about, just going all in to make sure we tell the story the right way and in a beautiful way. And the film came out just beautifully done. Every single person that worked on it did just above and beyond. And we're very proud of it.
Yeah, and it says this is a true story because it's pretty much, since mom and dad are alive and we were able to talk to so many people, we have exactly what, it's exactly what they told us, had happened. And so that's been real neat to be able to put that together. And it's interesting, like we talk about a Christian movie, but 95% of this movie is not Christian because none of them were Christians. And so it wasn't to the end where they actually embraced this faith or whatever. And so it's just a real story of like how damaging, people can make their lives. And my father had certainly done that, a lot of hope and promise and, but then he just, went terribly south. And then, when all hope seemed lost, that's when the gospel came in there. And so it pretty much ends right when dad becomes a believer. He gets the idea like, okay, now once he's sobered up, I can maybe build duck calls. And then it just, obviously we know how it ends because, here we are now. Yeah. But that's that story is from and it's a timepiece set in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. So it's kind of cool going back in time and seeing how, shockingly, the places we shot it very near where they grew up, and it pretty much looks the same. It looks like it's been stuck in time anyway.
But the early response, like from the people that have seen it, we've done screeners and things like that, has been fantastic. And from some press that have seen it already, as we've been doing these kind of interviews about it, it's been really amazing to see how it's impacted people already. And also, I think, there's an expectation sometimes with independent films or Christian films that they might be, cheesy or whatever. And, we've gotten none of that. That's been really rewarding to see too. Even our kids, whenever we first showed our kids, that's the test. You're like, they're all in their 20s, are they going to think this is good? And they were like, whoa, that's like a real movie. That's not cheesy at all. It's not, preachy or anything like that. I think it's just really beautifully done. And we're really, really proud of it.
Tell us again the release date.
September 28th. And there's a website, theblindmovie.com, that you can go and kind of look for your theater and all that.
All right, so let me ask you one final question. People are going to be wondering how this discussion came about. And so I don't remember exactly how we made initial contact. I remember we met at a corporate event. Willie, you and I met at a corporate event. That was the first time we had a chance to speak in person. But do you remember how it is that we made contact to begin with and why?
Yes. So in a random way. So first of all, our son, John Luke, read your book years ago and gave it to me. And we're big readers. We love to read. And he was like, Mom, read this. So good. 12 Rules, that one. And then we went back and read Maps of Meaning and all that and just started listening to your podcast and have loved you and followed you and prayed for your family. That's a gift that people give us. They tell us, like, as we're walking around, like, oh, we pray for your family. And so we've prayed for your family over the years and have just followed along in your journey. And it was similar in timeline. We came out in 2012, so similar kind of in timeline as well. And so actually a year or so ago, I was in Copenhagen and met a friend there in Copenhagen, and he said that you had been there the week before, and we got in a discussion, and so I asked if he'd share my email with you so that we could kind of exchange emails, and we did that for a minute. I kind of told you a little bit about our family, but we didn't connect until Willie met you at the Dave Ramsey speaking conference.
And that you gave me such gold, you don't even realize what you gave me, which was a really funny story, which those are the things I cherish. So so you were going to be there. Korie was not able to come because we had our...
I had planned to come because I wanted to meet you, of course, as we had communicated a little bit, but we had a new grandbaby. So, of course, I had to be home with our new grandbaby. So I didn't get to come.
And even in our marriage, which I know we're fixing to talk about that, but my status went up because we were on the same venue together. And so, and Korie's like, it's Jordan Peterson and you. And I knew what she meant when she said it, like somebody doesn't belong at this big conference. And I know, and so, which I was kind of like, hey, here we are. So she was like, well, you know, let me know when you talk to him and all that. And so I was going to meet you before you went on stage, because I had spoken the day before. And then, but it didn't work out. You were doing something with your mic, and so I said, "We'll just wait till afterwards." So you come off the stage, and when I saw you, which of course you don't know who I am, and you're like, "Hey," and you said, "What are you doing at the?" You said, "What are you doing at the conference?" And I said, "I'm speaking." And for whatever you said, did you speak to the whole group? Which really made me laugh, because I was like, I think you thought I was like maybe like the maintenance crew, because you're not going to say you judged me, but you were looking at my appearance and you were thinking, how are you just out there and what were you talking about? And I said, I was speaking to the whole group. And then you asked me what I was speaking about. And I told you neuroscience and Canadian politics. And that was a joke. And everybody started laughing.
Yeah, that was good. That was good.
But I could see your brain was spinning. And so I was proud that I had you speechless, especially after just talking to you for a couple hours. I had you speechless just for a second while that computed in there. So that's how we met. And then I told Korie. And then, but you said, yes, I remember your wife emailed, and then we circled back, and here we are.
Right. Yeah, well, Korie, I'm very glad to know that a hick from Northern Alberta takes precedence in your imagination over a hick from Louisiana. So I would have never suspected that. So it's good to know anyways. All right, well, look, guys, that was great. I'm hoping your movie like blasted out of the park. That seems highly probable to me. For everybody watching and listening, I'm going to talk to Willie and Korie Robertson for another half an hour on the Daily Wire Plus platform. We're going to talk about their marriage. I'm very interested in, biographical details of people's lives. And I'm particularly interested in how their marriage has survived the, rapid expansion of their lives and all the twists and turns that their lives have taken. They obviously seem to like each other. One of the things that's quite striking about talking to you two, by the way, is that you're very balanced in your turn taking, in your responses to this interview. You never step on each other. And I would say you guys probably talked about 50% of the time each, of the time that was devoted to your side of the camera. It was very interesting to see that, how careful you were about taking each other into account. I also watch couples all the time when I'm talking with them to see if there's some underground resentment or hostility, eye rolling, hopefully not that, and some competition there for status. And that's always a bad sign within a relationship. Like, it can be playful and competitive, but real status competition that's just not good inside a marriage. And so it was cool to see how on the same page you were in your discussions about what had happened, about your family life, and how you also translated that into this very playful and easy turn-taking in the conversation. So anyways, that's what the clinical psychologist in me noticed while we were talking. And so God only knows what I'll notice when we talk on the Daily Wire side, which we're going to do in moments. And so we're going to close this up. If you guys who are watching and listening want to attend to the conversation about marriage within the Duck Dynasty, please join us on the Daily Wire Plus side of things. And thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you two. I'm really looking forward to your movie. Like I said, I hope it's ridiculously successful and helpful to people. You certainly whetted my appetite to go see it. I want to see how this all came about and how you managed this movie. So it'll be fun to see that. And so thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me today. And as I said, it's been a pleasure getting to know you.
Awesome. Great talking to you.
Great talking to you. This was awesome. Thanks so much.